150,000 tech workers have been laid off in 2020.
Amazon has confirmed a coming round.
It's going to cut 18,000
Allocating resources from last year showed that IT hiring is down by thousands.
The job market has changed dramatically over the last few years, and if you're watching this video, you're probably struggling just to get invited to an interview. I know that there are still a lot of opportunities out there, but the ways how to get them have changed as well. And in this video, I want to talk about some of the most important things you have to do right now to get them. But before we start, I want to shortly talk about the current state of the job market. Is it really that bad? Are there no jobs out there anymore? I think there's still jobs out there, but the landscape has changed a lot. Due to the advances of AI and the change of the economy, there is a lot of movement in the job market. Whereas in 2021, it was really easy to get a job because all the companies were overhiring. Now it is really difficult because the requirements and the expectations have changed a lot. I think one of the biggest contributors is the general economy, which was going up and up and up over the last years until Corona, where the whole economy was in a shock. And even back then in 2020, all the hiring froze. I don't know if you were also searching for a job there, but I know from myself and friends that it was really difficult to get a job there because all of the companies, they were frozen. They didn't want to hire. They didn't want to take the risk to go into this unknown period and hire people. But then when we learned how to live with COVID and the consequences, the companies started hiring again. And back then, the interest rates were incredibly low. They were almost at zero. And for companies, money was essentially free. This led them to borrow a lot of money, get a lot of investments, and hire a lot of people because company growth, even in headcount, was always seen as something good. And one of the most interesting things was, if you overlay the charts of the layoffs and the charts of the interest rates, they almost align perfectly. So I think this was a huge contributor. Because money is now much more expensive than before due to the increased interest rates, companies are much more hesitant to hire developers, especially developers earlier in their career. So to still get a job in this climate, you have to change your strategies a bit. And that leads me to the next point, cold applying. A lot of people are just used to, when they want to have a new job, they just go on LinkedIn or on Glassdoor, they find a job and they just send a CV. No one knows you, there's no referral, you just send the best version of your CV you can build. You send there and the companies currently receive hundreds and hundreds of CVs. The last position I advertised as an engineering manager, I got over 500 CVs in a couple of days. And no one can really go through them, no one can really look at all of them, and you have to stand out like crazy if you want to get a job like this. So I think you can still do that. I think it's still valuable to send CVs to companies you are interested in. But I think you should not rely on it because as you see on Reddit and all the other forums, people are sending hundreds and hundreds of CVs to those big companies and they're getting basically no responses. So I think now you need to change your strategy. And one of the first things you can do is show that you are really interested in the company. That is not only tailoring your CV to them, but reading up on them, understanding their problems, maybe going to their events and really showing that you're interested in them and that you're not just randomly sending CVs out. I think that can increase your chances a lot. And to not only give you abstract or general advice, I want to tell you a quick story of how that could look like in reality. I know someone personally who did an interview with someone, and in the interview the candidate did okay, but was not really great, and they were not really sure if they should give the candidate another chance. But I think a few days later, there was a company meetup where they had just a normal tech meetup where there were a few talks and a bit of networking. And this candidate took the time and showed up and shook the hand and said like, hey, it's me, we interviewed a few days ago. And this completely changed the sentiment. They all of a sudden noticed that the candidate really cares and gave the candidate another chance. So in this case, it increased the chances of the candidate by a lot. Another thing that has changed a lot, I think, is with the advances of AI and all those tools we can use, the focus shifts a lot from the technical knowledge, from the knowledge of programming language or libraries you have, to the actual problem-solving skills. So, are you good at communicating? Are you good at understanding the business problems? Like, do you also as a software engineer understand what they're trying to solve and can bring some ideas to maybe improve the processes or the product with your suggestions? But also, I think one of the most important things you have to focus on right now is asking the right questions. What is the business interested in? What problem are they solving? How can you approach it? And I think the whole focus currently shifts from hiring people that just know a framework or a library. I think a few years back you could just say, hey, I know React, hire me, and that would have worked. But now you have to change your attitude a bit towards the product, the business, the domain they're in, and understand what they're doing to be able to use the right tools, maybe even with AI, with Copilot, with ChatGPT, with the OpenAI API to solve their problems efficiently. It's not only about having the skill set, but also about proving that you can solve problems. And the next thing I want to talk about is one of the things that is true all the time. It was true back then, but it is much more important now. Especially when you're starting out new, you don't have much experience to draw from, and in the interviews or in your CV, you cannot show much. There it is incredibly important that you build stuff on your own. And it is important that you don't only focus on what you were assigned to in university or the task you had in a boot camp. We as interviewers, we're always looking for, is this person genuinely interested? Are they good at what they're doing and are they curious about the technologies? And one of the best ways you can do that is building things yourself and showing it. This is what a lot of people forget. They code a lot, but they never can show it or talk about it during an interview. And some of the projects, I mean, are building a website or being excited about your home automation, automating your lights or your door locks, or something you can program, buying a Raspberry Pi and coding some home server and doing something with that. Another very common thing is, I had that back in my days where friends asked me, hey, I need a web shop, how to do that? And of course you can configure that with Shopify, but you could also set yourself a challenge and build that from scratch and be able to show that during your interviews. And as you can imagine, that impresses hiring managers a lot during the interview, but also on your CV under other projects. And here I also have a great story to share. A few years back, I needed to hire 3 freelancers for a project we were working on, and we had a bit of a tight deadline, and the business decided that we get 3 freelancers to help us. And I started to do a lot of interviews and interview people. And at some point I met this one guy I hired eventually, and now we became friends. And the whole interview didn't feel like a stiff interview, like a Q&A where I asked stiff questions and he gave me stiff answers. We just chatted about things we're excited about. And at this time we needed someone who helps us with our architecture and especially with testing. And he said, hey, I'm super passionate about testing. I even built my own libraries. And then he said, by the way, I also wrote my own library in Node.js to read environment variables. And he open sourced it, he published it, and it has 100,000 downloads a week. This is where I, as an interviewer, immediately see that someone is curious, proactive, can solve problems, and is somehow excited about what he's doing. And that was basically enough for me to hire him, because I had enough of evidence that this person can solve problems and can probably be super effective in this job. And that was one of the best hires I've ever made. He was great at his job, everyone liked him, and he's still at the company. So this is one of the examples where someone built something and showed it to us and convinced us right away that he's the right candidate. So building your own stuff and showing it is incredibly important, especially when you're starting out. And the next thing I want to talk about is reaching out to people directly. But that is also easier said than done. Because as opposed to cold applying, where you just send hundreds of CVs everywhere, here you actually really have to think about what you're writing to not just spam people. Here it is a very bad strategy just to spam hundreds of people and send them generic messages. Here it is really important if you are interested in the company. And then you can, for example, go to LinkedIn and find specific people in that company. What I always do first is I target the talent and HR people of this company, which is super easy on LinkedIn to find. Why I target them is because they are usually much more used to speaking to people that just reach out and are interested in roles. And one of the really helpful things I found here was that you can also write companies that don't explicitly have the role on their website. You can just write them and say like, hey, I'm really interested in what you're doing. I would love to work with you. This is my expertise. I know that there's no role, but maybe in the future we can come together. And here I actually have an example of myself. I found this really cool company I was interested in, and I couldn't find an engineering manager position, which I was interested in back then. And I just did exactly what I just explained to you. I wrote them a message, and in LinkedIn, the first message you write is pretty short. You have a limited character count, but you can also write a personalized message. And I just wrote, hey, I'm Leo, I'm an engineering manager. I'm fascinated about the stuff you're building. I'd love to connect and see if there are any opportunities. And this recruiter immediately replied and said, hey, thanks for reaching out. I'd be happy to explore opportunities with you. What kind of role are you interested in? Because currently we don't have the role you're looking for. And then I said, I know, thanks for the quick response. Here's my profile. Here's what I'm interested in. And I also know that you don't have my role right now, but maybe you have one in the future. To which he then replied that, thanks for clarifying. At this time, we don't have the position, so we have to wait a bit. And it's easier if they have this need to then talk to me. And here, even though I clarified my expectations and what I wanted, I felt like the conversation was not that memorable, not that personal. And I just said, yeah, that makes sense. Please keep me on your shortlist for such opportunities. And as soon as you hear, we probably need an engineering I'm happy to read a message from you, and we continue then. And that was just a joke, but I also wanted to make the conversation memorable and somehow personal to me. And just 2 weeks later, he pinged me again and said, hey Leo, it didn't take long before it happened. I've now heard the words, we probably need an engineering man. And this is how we made a connection, and he remembered me and immediately reached out while they heard in a meeting that they might need one, even before the roles were advertised and so on. I could start the conversation and get a foot in the door. And I think this is one of the most important things you have to do in this market, as opposed to just sending hundreds of CVs. Another thing I want to talk about is obviously AI. And a lot of companies are searching for people that have experience with AI, or at least that show some curiosity. And it cannot hurt to go onto Hugging Face, to download some LLMs, to play around with Llama 2 or whatever, and build some small application, or just do a tutorial. But you have to show currently that you are interested and that you are willing to work with it. I think tools like Copilot and the whole suite of OpenAI is incredibly important right now, and a lot of companies are embedding at the core of their projects some of such tools. And if you're not willing to do that, or if you're not even showing the curiosity to work with it, it will be really difficult to get a job right now, especially as a new starter. And if you really want to increase your chances to get a job, you probably have to subscribe to my channel. Okay, I'll probably cut that out. The next thing I would recommend if you're looking for a job when you're sending tons of CVs but you're not getting any responses is to shift your focus a bit. I think over the last years, the big tech companies, FAANG, Facebook, Apple, Netflix, Google and so on, they were so big and so attractive that a lot of people only focused on them. And even in Europe, people wanted to work at Google or Spotify. And I think now is the time to shift your focus a bit from those big tech giants who hired massively, who are building these huge things and need hundreds of developers, to those smaller companies. Especially with remote work, there are a lot of more conservative companies, maybe even governments or local companies that are desperately looking for good developers and are even paying good salaries and have really interesting projects. So now you have to search a bit more and maybe start with smaller companies before going to the big corporations that have much more applications and a much harder interview process. The last thing, and I think the most important thing that is true all the time, but is even more important right now, is to build a network. I know, it sounds obvious, and it is hard to accept if you're in a situation where you need a job right now, because building a network doesn't work in a week or a month where you need it. You have to start all throughout your career. But if you do that, and if you go out to meetups, which is one of my biggest recommendations, is go out to physical events. It is so different to get a CV as a hiring manager, read once through it and put it on a pile of, yeah, maybe we'll talk to them or maybe not, than to actually shake someone's hand and look them in the eyes, learn a bit about them, drink a beer with them, and then have an email where they say, hey, if there's an opportunity, you could reach out to me. This is so much more impactful and so much more personal that I always recommend you have to go to meetups. You can just go to meetup.com and search for events in your area and really invest some time in it. The worst thing that can happen is that you get a free slice of pizza and a free beer, watch some boring talks and go home. In an average case, you connect to a few people, and in the best case, you walk out of there with a job offer, which sometimes happens. A few years ago, I was really interested in meetups and I went to a lot of meetups, even meetups that were not related to what I was doing, just to meet people and to network a bit. And on one meetup, I knew a guy and he introduced me to another person and said like, hey, you have to talk. We chatted a bit, it was a fun evening. And a few days later, they invited me for dinner just to talk some more. And throughout that dinner, we just talked about random things, not really about the job opportunity, which is one of the most important things about it. Often, when you go to an interview, it's almost like a date. the job is already in focus and you're talking about, are we a good fit for each other? But during that dinner, we could just talk about random things, about our hobbies, about our interests, what we learned on the news recently. And that creates a much more human, much more genuine bond. And a bit later, I had an interview at this company with the guy I already knew and got a really good senior developer job there. And now we're still friends. So this is a much better and much more human way to get jobs and to get the jobs you actually like. Because even before going to the interview, we could already talk so much about my needs and their needs and the projects they're working on that we were both already sure that this is a good fit. Then we just had to do the formal interview and I got a great job offer. And I think this is the best way to get job opportunities in this harsh job climate. If you have any other tips I didn't mention in this video or questions, write them down in the comments and I try to answer them. I hope the tips I shared with you were interesting and maybe help you to get your next job. If in the meanwhile you want to improve your communication skills, I made a video about it, or I made a full playlist about how to prepare for a job interview. Good luck in your job search and see you in the next one.